Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're jumping into the work and life of Metin Erksan, a figure often called, the master of Turkish cinema. His career spans something like 40 years, and it was just defined by this relentless controversy.
Yeah, and director is, it's just not a big enough word for him, is it? He was more of a Dushun's Odavi, which is like a center of thought within the culture.
A center of thought. I like that.
He wasn't just pointing a camera at things. He was constantly reading, writing, producing these big ideas about the core issues of Turkish society and its identity.
Exactly. And he really laid it out himself, didn't he? The sources quote him saying, "A filmmaker must be a thinker, a writer, and a director." So that's our mission today, to unpack the legacy of this truly singular and, let's be honest, often prickly figure.
Well, to get Erksan, you have to get that intensity. He was a culture man through and through. I mean, you look at his non-film work. He wrote books on Ataturk, on the European community. It just shows how broad his intellectual commitment really was.
And his personal drive, it seems so contradictory. On one hand, he's passionately driven to depict his homeland with this incredible cinematic excellence.
Right.
But then that same passion made him seem contrary, dissident, and aggressive in his day-to-day life. It seems he demanded respect just as fiercely as he pursued his art.
And you see that same intensity spill over into his activism. He was absolutely instrumental in building the, formal structures of the industry.
He founded the Turkish Cinema Workers Union in 1961, right? The Turkish Sinema İşçileri Sendikası.
He did. He was its first president.
Which is such a paradox. I mean, founding a labor union, this massive collective effort, seems to fly in the face of his famous individualism later on. The sources say he refused to join any organization he hadn't started himself.
That's the classic Erksan paradox for you. He saw the need for a collective defense of labor, for sure. But his core belief was that artistic creation, it had to be singular.
So a champion for the worker, but a completely solitary artist.
Exactly. And that singular focus led to a lot of historical firsts.
He really did define the starting line for so many achievements. First Turk to win a major international prize with Susuz Yaz, which we'll get to. But even before that, he made the first film with a clear social message, Geçerlerin Ötesi.
And he won the first big battle against state censorship with Yılanların Oku.
And those censorship battles, they started immediately, didn't they?
Oh, from day one. His very first film, Karanlık Dünya, back in 1952, that kicked off decades of fighting with the authorities over what he was allowed to show.
It's just fascinating to see the scope of his early interests. You have films like Dokuzda Anafezi that show this deep dive into Ottoman society, historical takes, social problems, often through adapting literature.
Okay, so that's a perfect segue, actually, into his films as, direct political commentary.
Sure.
Let's talk about Geçerlerin Ötesi from 1960. He called it a reaction film.
A reaction to what, exactly? What was he pushing back against?
The big slogan of the time, tied to this push for modernization and capitalism, was this boast, "We will create a millionaire in every neighborhood."
Yeah.
Erksan made his film to show that, well, you're not just going to get millionaires. He wanted to show the darker side effects that would pop up in those same neighborhoods. The crime, the corruption, the disillusionment.
So it was almost like a theoretical prediction of what was coming.
Precisely. He saw it as his attempt to grapple with these huge social problems before the 1960 revolution and all the turmoil that followed. It was a proactive critique.
And he kept hammering that theme with Acı Hayat, or bitter life. On the surface, it's a love story, but underneath, it's tearing into that same millionaire ideal.
And its influence was just immense. Acı Hayat completely reshaped the Turkish melodrama. It set a template that was so powerful, they say a new version of it was basically shot every year after that. It locked in that genre for decades.
Then we get to maybe his most famous early fight, Yalanların Üçü, The Revenge of the Snakes from '62. That one sparked a massive censorship battle.
A huge one. It was based on a novel about rural injustice, and it went right to the top levels of government.
And the politics didn't stop once it was released, right? I read that it won an award at a festival, but was blocked from the top prize.
Yes, at the Carthage Festival in '66. The sources say a Turkish jury member specifically voted against it to keep it from winning the grand prize. That just shows you the level of hostility he was facing from within his own country.
And he believed the censorship never really ended for that film. He thought that even today it might not have official permission to be screened abroad.
It just illustrates this.
Yeah.
This permanently tense, often negative relationship he had with the state.
Before we move on, I think it's worth touching on his range, like with a film like Kuyu, The Well.
Yes, a deep, deep dive into passion and obsession. He was so committed to showing these complex, messy characters.
Right. And he was very clear that the man in Kuyu who pulls his wife by a rope, he's meant to be seen as a negative figure despite his passion.
Exactly. It's about realism and morality, not just cheap drama. He wanted you to think critically about human flaws, not just root for some obsessive guy's drive.
This philosophical rigor, it brings us right to the core of his radical individualism. Let's talk about this God King idea.
Okay, yes. He defined cinema as the product of a single person's will and desire. And he was blunt about it. He said cinema is not a collective job.
He called the director a Tanra Kral, a God King.
And he was careful to clarify that he meant a creative monopoly, a regime over the work itself, not like a political dictator. For him, a coherent artistic vision couldn't be diluted by collaboration. It just wasn't possible.
But how does that even work in practice? I mean, filmmaking takes hundreds of people. Is that a real ideology or just posturing?
It's highly rhetorical, but it did shape his methods. He had that famous analogy of the camera being like a pen, a stylo. It was a direct tool for him to express his thoughts, and the crew was there to execute the thinking of the author.
And that control extended to his casting policy, which is just unbelievable.
It's a remarkable detail, isn't it? He had a strict personal rule.
Yeah.
He never offered an acting role to anyone, ever.
For his whole career.
For over 45 years. He would only evaluate applications or, the pleas and requests from actors who came to him. He completely sidestepped the normal power dynamics of the industry.
That is unheard of. It just screams control. And he was just as firm about not talking about his work after it was done.
Oh, absolutely. He hated it when creators would explain their work, saying things like, oh, I did this for the people, or I did it for the revolution. He thought that just cheapened the whole enterprise.
So no guiding the audience's interpretation?
Not at all. His whole thing was, you have to let the audience think for itself. He'd say, you make the work, you let people watch it, and people know why it was made. Which all leads to his most famous line, I make my films for myself.
Which, on its own, sounds incredibly selfish for a filmmaker so engaged with social issues.
But his argument was that an artist has to say that to stay honest. He knew that since he lived among the people, his work would naturally reflect their reality. But the act of creation itself had to be for him, free from any external pressure.
That philosophy is so important when we get to Susuz Yaz, or Dry Summer, and its impact. Before it won the Golden Bear in Berlin in 1964, what was the Turkish establishment's view of its own cinema?
They were basically indifferent. Their only interaction was through censorship. They'd approve or ban a film, but they never celebrated it or invested in it as a national art.
But when Susuz Yaz won that prize, the sources say Kıyamet Koptu, chaos erupted.
It forced this huge, unavoidable cultural moment. Suddenly, the government, the intellectuals, they all had to acknowledge that Turkish cinema was a serious, world-class cultural force. It was the first time that it ever happened.
But here's the detail that I think proves the public was way ahead of the critics and the government.
The box office numbers.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Susuz Yaz came out in December 1963. In the 7 months before it won in Berlin, it made more than double what the highest-grossing Turkish films of the time made.
It's the ultimate proof. The Turkish public, despite what the critics were saying, they saw the film's power. They made it a massive commercial hit all on its own, with no international awards to validate it.
Now, the Berlin jury saw it as a modern take on the Cain and Abel story, two brothers, one woman. What did Erksan say his focus was?
He appreciated that, but he said his main focus was much more concrete. It was about the idea of property, specifically water rights. Who owns the water that comes from the land?
And the film actually had a real-world impact on that.
It did. He said it was an indirect factor in Turkish law being changed around 1969 to make source waters state property instead of private property.
Oh.
A truly massive cultural influence.
But this success, it didn't create unity. It started a bloody war.
Yeah, that 1964 win kicked off a fierce, ongoing cultural battle. Before that, Turkish films were treated like outcasts, barely allowed in the nice theaters.
And after,
it was this bitter fight between supporters of Turkish film and supporters of foreign film, who Erksan called agents and traitors for constantly lobbying against their own national cinema. It was a fight for the soul of Turkish movie theaters.
So with all that context, how did he define national cinema?
For him, it was simple. National cinema is all the films made in Turkey. And he insisted its true owner was the Turkish nation, the people, because the films were made with the nation's money, the nation's labor, with almost no outside capital or state help. He said Turkish cinema existed in spite of the state.
He also had strong feelings about the term "yesam."
Oh, he rejected it completely. He said, Yesam cinema was an unscientific, demeaning term used to belittle Turkish films. He admitted that melodramatic style was popular and brought people in, but he pointed out that so many other kinds of films, historical, dramatic, were made in that era too.
It sounds like his biggest frustration was the lack of academic rigor in his own field.
Absolutely. He hated that there was no proper scientific history of Turkish cinema. He thought the existing histories were all subjective and misleading. He'd argue the history should start in 1895 with world cinema, or at least 1907, when the first camera came to Turkey.
Finally, let's touch on his views on technology, because they were radical. He wasn't sad about cinema halls closing.
Not at all. He saw it as just natural technological progress. He compared it to rivers not flowing backward. He had no time for nostalgia.
And his definition of television is what's really striking. He didn't see it as a rival or a different art form.
No. He said television is not a separate art form. It's just the broadcasting vehicle for cinema, its latest stage of development. For Erksan, there was no real difference between watching a film on a giant screen or on what he called the white glass of a TV.
That is remarkably ahead of its time when you think about streaming culture today. He actually preferred watching at home.
He did. He said theaters were uncomfortable, restrictive. You couldn't talk, you couldn't pause, you couldn't really reflect on the film. It brings his whole philosophy full circle, doesn't it?
It really does. The art is made by one person's will for their own reasons, and the viewing experience should also be individual and self-directed. He was just a towering figure.
His anti-establishment stance, it just never softened. He said that a creative person should not even greet the political authority because the moment they do, that creator is finished.
Wow, that really highlights the tension, right? Between the artist as this god king of their own work and their need to be completely independent from power.
Exactly.
So it leaves you with this question, right? If an artist like Metin Erksan makes films only for himself and he doesn't measure success by awards or critics, then what is the best way to judge the success of that art? It's a really complex idea to sit with, that gap between why an artist creates and how the rest of us receive it.